land of the longleaf pine. Those words immortalized in the official state toast by the General Assembly in 1957 and this anthem. The longleaf pine is a legend in North Carolina, but the tree itself is far from immortal. Longleaf forests originally hovered over some 90 million acres from East Texas to North Carolina, but less than 2 million acres remain today. Very few of you probably know that, but a few are fighting feverishly to preserve the pine and its story that's as sticky as the sap from the tree itself.
You see how wet this is? They don't like wet feet.
Earl Imes is a 7th-generation farmer. It's in his blood, and that passion led him here to Johnston County 25 years ago.
The farmer who I purchased the land from back in the mid-1990s, his family acquired this land before the end of slavery. They're one of the biggest black farmers in the state. And he gave me a little historiography. He says, he was born in 1917, and he can remember working in the turpentine orchards back here in the 1920s and 30s and 40s as a little boy.
But as the longleaf pines were harvested on his land, a totally different ecosystem replaced it. Oaks, leaves, and underbrush replaced the longleaf trees and pine straw floor. Earl's fascination for history inspired him to try and reverse recent history.
So fast forward, he was able to teach me a lot about how to maintain the land, when to burn, how to burn, and to be especially burning and cognizant of the snakes and the water moccasins. But
we'll be staying away from that creek.
But yeah.
For 25 years now, Earl has planted longleaf pine, fueled controlled burns, and slowly watched the transformation.
So how old are these trees we're looking at right here? These bigger ones.
These are only 10 years old.
This is a relatively rare sight these days in North Carolina. I know a lot of you will say, wait a minute, I see pine trees every day. Yes, you do, but not longleaf pines.
When people see pines in North Carolina, a lot of them probably think, oh, the longleaf pine, but most of what they're seeing is this tree right here.
You're exactly right. Most of what people are going to see is a loblolly, and the loblolly has a better success rate of germination in a mixed forest like a hardwood forest. So that is why it's able to survive with the transformation of the forest better than the longleaf, because a longleaf absolutely has to have a scorched earth or all pine straw.
Have you noticed how much Earl knows about history? There is a reason. He's a walking, talking textbook. Beyond his personal passion, it's also his profession.
But if you can imagine how the bark of a pine tree comes together.
Earl is a curator at the State Museum of History, and he knows the history of the longleaf pine as well as anyone.
And what it would do is collect the sap in there.
Hundreds of years ago, the turpentine, tar, and pitch made from the longleaf pine tree were vital in shipbuilding and maintenance. When settlers first landed on our coast, they not only saw the trees, they saw a future.
The people from the old world come over here and see what we call North Carolina, and these giant longleaf pines. As far as they could see, it was like Shangri-La. And so immediately the English, put a bounty out in 1704. And it's one of the wealthiest bounties you'll see in the history of colonial era.
Some did get rich, but others paid a price through slavery.
The first Africans who were brought here, if you look in the records, are called Guinea people. And those people had been adept at working in the forest for thousands of years, had developed immunities against the tsetse flies and yellow fever and things like that, and were selected by slave traders on the continent of Africa, referred to the Europeans for the purposes of working in the pine forest.
Earl's passion for the longleaf pine goes way beyond his work and farm. Even on his days off, he's hoping to educate.
There are a few remaining in the town of Cary, but most of them were cut down back in the 1800s and early 1900s. Grab a handful, place it around just like that.
On the first day of spring, we followed Earl on a day-long mission to plant trees and plant seeds of inspiration.
And so if you can think of it in terms of planning for the future, we're planting and restoring our future with our natural history and heritage.
It started here in Cary, where Girl Scouts were planting longleaf pine, part of a community project. Earl is clearly in his element.
Here's to the land of the longleaf pine, the summer land where the sun does shine, where the wheat grows strong and the strong grow great. Here's the down home in the old North State. Yes.
pitch in the side.
Later that day, we head to a farm show in Lillington.
If you go home and tell your neighbor what I'm fixing to tell you, they're going to think you've been to college somewhere.
This is Earl's buddy Brian Avery, a Harnett County historian.
In the early days when they were making tar pitch, some of them did make a little turpentine to mix with things and for medicines.
He's demonstrating how the early settlers made the tar, turpentine, and pitch from the longleaf pines.
It's an oil. So it's the same resin as what we are cooking out for tar and pitch, but it's alive.
Brian calls it the greatest naval stores show on Earth, which it might be, but it might also be the only one.
I said, we got to figure out how they did it, guys. And I started searching for old men that was still living that had done it, and I couldn't find any. So I went back and started reading books from the 1800s that I could find. And so we kept doing that, reading books,
Wait a minute, you read books from 1700s to teach yourself how to do this?
Yeah, 1800s.
It's a dirty job, and a whiff of that smoke will grab your nose's attention in a heartbeat. That's where the Tar Heel moniker originally started. But it was not a compliment, especially to the slaves working in the forest.
People who were brought from Africa, of course, were denied their identity and heritage and couldn't be known, so they're derided in many instances as guinea people or tar heels or tar babies, and it becomes a derisive term. That's something that's akin today to the N-word. And so that was the original moniker of a tar heel.
But during the Revolutionary War, a new meaning began to twist the term.
The rebel army of 1776 of the American Patriots was using the turpentine orchards to mask their battles also. So they would set them on fire and become a smoky scene, and just the guerrilla warfare would break out. And when the smoke clears, where the term comes, there's British casualties all over, and the Americans are retreating back into the swamps. Lord Cornwallis engages in one of these type battles, and he makes the remark, they're fighting like they got tar stick to their heels. And so that, when you kind of get that first kind of turn in the curve of it not being so much of a derisive term, but I dare say, in 1780 or 81, when we're talking about, if you had called a white man a tar heel, it would have been the basis for a duel.
It was during the Civil War the term really found its new meaning that many know it as today.
They said them North Carolina boys were standing in a line of battle as if they still had tar on their heels. They turned a derogatory term into a badge of honor.
Eventually, tens of millions of acres were clear-cut for timber as the state developed, leaving our state with at most a few 100,000 acres compared to millions in our past. Conservation efforts are underway, but it's largely people like Brian and Earl.
Obviously, with development, we'll never get back to where we were, several hundred years ago. But where do you think we can get back to?
Well, we can get back to as much of an effort that we are willing to put together.
And so Earl continues to plant, growing roots for these trees and his family.
You're in your 50s. You likely won't see the end of what you're trying to do here, right?
Well, no, it's something that you do for your children and your children's children. And as a farmer, you have faith that what you plant, you'll reap over time. It'll create as an ecosystem and an opportunity for wealth and value, for my family and generations. An African proverb says a wise man might not ever stand under the tree that he plants, but we're getting close here. If you want to.